Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Great High Holiday sermons for today, pre-High Holiday and High Holiday series. Hopefully you have the opportunity also to learn with Rabbanit Bracha, who's doing 4 classes mornings and repeated in the evenings on the book of Yonah. And during Aseret Yemei Tshuva, Rabbi Sarah will be teaching a one-off class as well. So various opportunities to learn. I also want to plug our Elul Shabbat learning opportunities with guest drashot over the Shabbatot and guest shiurim in the afternoon. So a lot of, because we have a full month of Elul after Labor Day, we have more opportunities to learn together. This series is for me an opportunity to peruse some of the high holiday drashot that were written by figures whose writings and thinking fascinate me, and we will look at their various writings over these few weeks. It's hard to do necessarily more than just one sermon for each of them, but hopefully it will be a teaser, and I'm happy to help you access the broader corpus of their writing, some more easy than others. When it comes to Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, we're blessed that his writings and speeches are very easily accessible. You could literally type Lamb, Lamm, archive into Google and be very easily taken to the Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb archives. Of course, in addition to people devoted to organizing, archiving, and uploading, one also needs to write out one's sermons for that to be possible. It's a reminder to myself because many weeks my sermons appear just in bullet or note form. And if one wants them accessible to anyone for posterity, it's a good practice to write them out. So we're blessed to have Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb's drashot, many decades worth. You can see that they were written on a typewriter, and a typewriter that did not have Hebrew. So the Hebrew is handwritten in, as you'll see when I share it on the screen for those who don't see it yet. Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb was born in Brooklyn in 1927 and studied at... what's that?
I said he's my age.
Yes, he's your age, Estelle. Amazing. And studied chemistry, was his class valedictorian at Yeshiva College, where he graduated in 1949, summa cum laude, and was ordained a rabbi in 1951 and got his PhD in Jewish philosophy from Yeshiva University's Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies in 1966. He was a professor at YU. He was a pulpit rabbi for 25 years, primarily at the Jewish Center in Manhattan. But before that at KJ, Kilat Jethroon, as an assistant rabbi and a rabbi in Congregation Kadima in Springfield, Massachusetts. I'm reading excerpts from his bio on the archive website where you can find these things as well. He wrote over 15 books, a treatise on Torah Umada, the espoused philosophy of Yeshiva University, really an extraordinary work on the religious thought of Hasidism, key excerpted texts around the themes of Hasidic thought with bios of their, authors and analysis of the way different schools of Hasidut develop different ideas, and more widely published many articles, including one which very germane to our discussion, called Notes of an Unrepentant Darshan, in which he kind of writes about the art of the sermon, its evolution over a couple of generations from the European rabbis who came to America to the next generation of American rabbis, to what he saw when he wrote this in 1986 as a new generation of rabbis that were disdainful of the drush sermon, and sort of said, we only give shiurim. What is the need for homiletics? And he was pushing back against that. And writing about his relationship to the sermon. In there, he talks about the key influences on his own development. Rabbi Lookstein, the Rav, and one other rabbi, and also talks about senior Rabbi Lookstein, and also talks about sometimes the differentiation between the regular Shabbat drasha and the high holiday sermon. because in so many congregations, the population vastly expanded or changed for the high holidays, and how that had to shape the thought that went into the sermon. In fact, while this sermon we're going to look at, I think, is classified in the archives under high holiday sermons, it's not really a high holiday sermon. It's on one of the parshiot just a couple of weeks before, so it's kind of in the theme of Elul and anticipating the high holidays, so it's a little bit of a cheat to include it here. It's not really a Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur sermon, but it spoke to me for this moment. It's certainly seasonal. This week's parasha is Ki Teitzei. He wrote the drasha we're going to look at on Parashat Ki Tavo, which is next week's parasha. And since we won't get to it, I want to recommend to you, if you wind up perusing the archives, one sermon, which is under Shmini Atzeret, and it was a sermon that was written for Simchat Torah 1973, which was when the Yom Kippur War of 1973 was already underway. And the title is, How Can We Be Happy on This Simchat Torah? It obviously resonates very, very much for all the questions we are asking ourselves today. And his answer, the Bai just sent out yesterday our kind of, a preliminary vision of how we plan to incorporate remembrances of the 1-year anniversary of October 7th and the ongoing war and our lived reality into the Chagim, which are coming up. Our answer differs slightly from his. He sort of says, if we really understand what Simcha is, nothing needs to change on Simchat Torah. I agree that there is quite of a depth and a breadth to what Simcha is, and also that our Simchat Torah will necessarily be a little bit different. But I encourage you to find that sermon from 1973 under Shmini Atzeret in the holiday section of the archives. Okay, that's by way of introduction. And I'm going to open up on the screen share the sermon so you can see it for those on Zoom. Those in person have it in front of you. And we'll read, and I'll make some comments as we go. I may alternate back and forth between sharing for those on Zoom the sermon and the two key texts that he refers to. So this was September 15th, 1973, before the Yom Kippur War. And he titles this, One Nation, All Alone Under God. I don't know actually whether the sermon titles were published in advance. In other words, like when you walked into shul in the synagogue bulletin, was the sermon title listed, or was it applied afterwards, or was it on the title of his page but not said out loud? I'm not sure. One Nation, All Alone Under God. He writes, in the portion of this week's reading, which describes the blessings that will come upon Israel, we read one verse that is outstanding by its magnificence. And by the way, as we read, we imagine ourselves in the pews. What would it have been like to hear this sermon? What's the register of his language? How does he teach? Where does he introduce current events and the message? What's the balance between classical Torah content and applied lessons for life? These are the things that sermon writers think about, and that anybody who's a public speaker trying to be persuasive with an audience might think about. So one verse that is outstanding by its magnificence. By the way, we're sometimes taught in homiletics, like you're never supposed to begin in this week's parsha. But, I think that advice is overblown. I don't think you lose your audience if you don't, as Dr. J.J. Schachter once said to us in homiletics, drop your pants in the first 15 seconds. I think it's possible to, begin by quoting the Torah and then going on your journey. That's what he does here. Okay. And what is that quote? V'ra'u kol amei haaretz ki shem Hashem nikra alecha v'yara'u mimeka. And all the nations of the world will see that the name of the Lord is called upon you, and they will be afraid of you. Maybe we could say, when we talk about yirah in our relationship with God, we sometimes call it fear of God. Sometimes we call it awe or reverence. So it's interesting. He really, for the purposes of this sermon, he kind of wants to lean into the idea of actual fear. Maybe that's, an appropriate usage when it comes to human human interpersonal or international relations as opposed to theological. But it's interesting that he chooses this translation just for a slightly broader context to understand this, the passage he's quoting from. So in the beginning of Parashat Kitavo, we're told, not quite in the beginning, but in Parashat Kitavo, we're told that if you keep the commandments, many blessings will devolve upon you. Blessed you'll be in the city, and blessed you'll be in the country, etc., etc. A series of baruchs in the beginning of chapter 28, and then it says God will rout your enemies, will ordain blessings for you, and then in verse 9, Yekimcha Hashem lo la'am kadosh kasher nishba'ah lach. God will establish you as God's holy people, as was sworn to you. Ki tishmor et mitzvot Hashem Elokecha v'halachta b'drachav. If you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in God's ways. So this is actually it's in the middle of the series of blessings, but it kind of closes one section because it goes back to this refrain of if you keep the commandments. But then it continues on. Not only that, it seems if you keep the commandments and you walk in God's ways, then all the peoples of the earth will see that God's name is proclaimed over you. As a reader of the Torah, we could ask the question, what exactly does that mean? How do people see? Is it just by virtue of the blessings, our prosperity and success? People will say, oh, this is God's people. What does it exactly mean that God's name is proclaimed over you? It doesn't say they will see that you are God's chosen nation. But something interesting here. Shem Hashem nikra alecha v'yaru umimeka. And here JPS translates also as they will stand in fear of you. Okay, so that's the context. And it goes on to describe more blessings. Okay, back to our text. What does Moses mean when he says that the name of the Lord will be called upon you? The Talmud in Brachot 6a quotes an answer by one of the greatest of all sages, Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol, the Great. In a pithy comment of but 3 words, he says, Elu tfilin sheberosh. That the name of the Lord that is called upon us refers to the tefillin that we wear upon the head. Okay, so the rabbis and Rabbi Lamb says this in his essay, The Unrepentant Darshan. He says when people criticize sermons, he often says to them, the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud were the original darshanim. They offered homiletical interpretations of verses in order to try to inspire the people, exhort the people, develop a theological and legal system. So we're in good company here. So here is one such drasha, Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol, curious about the same thing we're curious about. What does it mean God's name will be called upon you? And how will people see that? Not just they will understand, but they'll visualize the idea that God's name is called upon you. Well, we have head tefillin. People see that, and they understand that we literally have God's name. How would they necessarily know what's inside the box? Okay, but this is, there's a movement back and forth here between a message that's being sent to the other nations and what is being communicated to the Jewish people. We know that we are wearing God's name, and they see that we have this unusual dress, and somehow that heightens their awareness that we are a people committed to God. That's the tefillin we wear upon the head. Now, the thrust of the sermon is not dependent on the mitzvah of tefillin, but I wonder whether in some subtle way invoking tefillin is like a little reminder about the mitzvah of putting on tefillin, of all the different things that could be quoted. So these are all questions I ask myself. Did he purposely want to bring up tefillin, as a reminder of this important mitzvah? Maybe, maybe not. Okay. How remarkable. Is that all it takes to frighten away the anti-Semite bent upon a pogrom? Is the tefillin worn upon the head really sufficient to neutralize the venom of the anti-Jewish enemy, his plentiful arms and allies, right? So Rabbi Lamb says, if we take the rabbinic interpretation, we plug it back into the verse, it seems to be saying that people will see your head tefillin and they will be afraid of you. Now, this is, I think, what we call in learning, I don't know if we call it in sermonics, a klutz kasha, right? This is not, it doesn't literally, it's a setup. It's a setup question. He doesn't really take that seriously, that possibility, nor is he even necessarily arguing that that's what the rabbis mean when they offer this interpretation, but he sets it up so that he can then develop what he really thinks is going on here. If we turn to the Talmudic passage from which this quotation is taken and study it in context, we discover what I believe is the real meaning. That's a classic, homiletical move. The real meaning, the true message, the deeper message, the real meaning of the statement of Rabbi Eliezer the Great. Immediately after quoting his response, the Talmud asks, Hane tefillin de mare alma, ma katuv ba. I'm not going to translate it here because he'll translate it in his next paragraph. Mi ka'amcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael, Atem asituni chativa achat ba'olam, v'ani e'aseh etchem chativa achat ba'olam. The Agadah, a rabbinic legend, a homiletical interpretation, often speaks of the tefillin that are worn not only by man, but by God. Now the Talmud asks, we know that in the tefillin of man is written the profession of unity. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, Shema Yisrael. But what is written in the tefillin that so to speak, God himself wears? They answer, the rabbis answer for us, that the tefillin of God bear the message, Mika amcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz, who is like unto thy people Israel, one nation upon the earth. And the rabbis explain, he's continuing on to translate this continuation of the passage from Talmud Brachot. The Lord said to Israel, you made of me a unity in the world, chativa achat. So I too will reciprocate and make of you a unity in the world. Our spousal, now this is his interpretation, our espousal of God's oneness is reciprocated by God's affirming our uniqueness in the world. Now, reading our original passage in context, we see that the name of the Lord refers not to man's, but to God's tefillin shel rosh, right? Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol offered this cryptic response. What does it say? V'ra'u amei ha'aretz, the people will see that God's name is called upon you. It just says, Elu tefillin shel rosh. But it seems that it's not the head tefillin of people, it's the head tefillin of God. Hence, what the sages really meant to say is this. What will win respect and inspire awe in others is the Jewish ability to stand alone, to be a chativa achat ba'olam, a single unit, to risk loneliness, to remain secure though friendless, to hold its own, if necessary, against the entire world. When Jews have sufficient faith in the name of the Lord to act on the basis of the confidence that we will remain goy echad ba'aretz, one nation upon the earth, then we will survive and we will flourish. So again, he's interpreting based on the juxtaposition of these two passages in the Talmud, the fact that the verse, the nations of the world will see that the Lord your God's name is called upon you, and they will revere you, fear you. These are the tefillin shel rosh. But then the continuation asks, well, what is in God's tefillin? And he interprets from that they mean that the thing that the people of the nations of the world will see and cause them to fear you is God's tefillin. It's the relationship that we have with God where we define God as our one God, and God makes us, inspires us to stand alone, proud and strong as one nation, irrespective of kind of what else is happening out there in the world. And it's that one-to-one relationship and capacity to stand proud and strong no matter what comes that is what the nations of the world see and causes them to fear or revere the Jewish people. And he goes on. That is true for us as individuals. If we are embarrassed by our Jewishness and fearful of being outsiders and aliens in a non-Jewish culture, if we will yield easily to the majority's pressures upon us to conform, then we will deserve no yir'ah or respect for us, because we will have dishonored ourselves. Those pseudo-wasps, those Jews who would have preferred to be reborn non-Jewish, who do not acknowledge their ethnic origins or religious traditions, are in truth not authentically human. Strong language here. The self-deniers have, as it were, ripped the tefillin off the head of God and left themselves both headless and heartless. I'm imagining myself in the pews hearing incredibly strong language of not being fearful of being identified as a Jew, and the kind of and of not giving in to the pressure to kind of assimilate, conform, whatever it is. And the harshness of the critique is, in my mind, quite extraordinary, profound. And I don't know, of course, what would Rabbi Lamb have said offering a sermon to our world today, which is 50 years different from the moment in which he was speaking 50 years earlier. Would he have offered the same sermon? Should the message change? My message, I think, would have been softer. I don't offer that as a critique. I don't know what I would have said 50 years ago. But when I think about offering this message today, I think I would offer a softer version, recognizing still the, inspiration to be a proud, defiant Jew, but without perhaps the criticism of those who were struggling with where they belonged. That's my own, sermonic approach, but I take his, at face value for what it is, a powerful call and charge. And again, I have no idea how it was received in its time and place. Okay, do you want to comment? Sure. Please feel free. Yeah, great. We're gonna have a word from Rabbi Scott, and another amazing darshan in his own right, and then we'll continue on. Please.
I'm just thinking that what I thought of when I read this was the conversation between Golda Meir and Henry Kissinger.
Tell us.
Right. So I don't remember the details, but when Golda Meir comes to talk to Kissinger, who at the time was Secretary of State for Nixon, he says to her, he identifies himself, and the last identifier is that he was born a Jew. And Golda Meir says, fortunately, we read from left to right. And, I think in part, that's how it resonates with me, that, Kissinger was a controversial figure in the Jewish community. I mean, people really worried about having a Secretary of State who was Jewish, not unlike now. But the circumstances are different. And Israel was in dire straits. And I can understand why a leader in the Jewish community would attack someone of that ilk.
Yeah, the global situation, the geopolitical situation was so complex, tense, conflicted, and he comes to that at the end of the drasha very explicitly, and its resonances for today are undeniable. In fact, Rav Avi has reminded me on a few occasions that when he spoke downstairs in the social hall, Kol Nidre night this past year, he had 3 messages, and one of them was, America is an ally, that allyship is important, don't take it for granted, and also and we stand alone. That was one of the 3 messages. The other 2 were equally prescient. I just can't recall them to mind right now. But he truly was prophetic, and this, yeah. Yes, Elisheva says it stayed with her over this year. Yeah, absolutely. Rav Avi said to me, as we were talking about this upcoming high holidays, and he said, I don't need to speak, but I think back to what I said last year, and maybe, I will try to find some words. And I said, we would very much want you to, of course. No pressure. You don't have to predict the future or say, again, but the insight and intuition and wisdom of Rav Avi is always on point for us. So yes, so that's very much in the in the context, I think 100%, and he'll come back to it. What Rabbi Eliezer is telling us, by the way, I think just also this rhetorical move, of making it Rabbi Eliezer's drasha, right? That's always, I'm not just telling you what I think. I'm telling you the message of the sages from time immemorial for us. What Rabbi Eliezer is telling us is that we must have the courage of our convictions and ignore the pressure of numbers. If you think you are right, if you are convinced that what you are doing is correct and moral, then do not be worried by the fact that most people are against you, that you may look silly, that people will gaze at you as though you came from another world. If you are right, proceed to do what is right in your eyes, and do not be worried that you offend majority opinion. Now, I'll just say briefly two things. One, he's really, I think, speaking to the individual. He's speaking personally. He says that at the beginning of the previous paragraph. That is true for us as individuals, right? And the movement between the personal and the national, I think, is often an important movement on the high holidays, as at any time. There's a message for us as individuals, and there's a message for us as a community or as a nation. I think that's always an important kind of duality to keep in mind. Also, I want to keep in mind that he suggested in the beginning of his interpretation that if we, stand by our convictions and our morals and do the right thing, so the implication of the rabbinic passage here and its interpretation of the biblical passage is that people will fear and revere us. I don't think he fully circles back to make a convincing argument about that. In the end, I think he really focuses on you have to not be afraid of what other people will think of you and do what you think is right. I don't think he can guarantee, nor I don't think it's necessarily been borne out that actually wins the fear and admiration and respect of people a lot of the time. It doesn't. It ought to, and we do it because it's the right thing to do. But does it guarantee, that standing strong with your morals and convictions wins the respect? It wins the respect of respectable people, but it doesn't necessarily win the respect of many people. Indeed, Rabbi Eliezer the Great himself beautifully exemplified this principle. He was born to a very wealthy father. This is the story part of the sermon, but it's a rabbinic story, not a kind of, story from today, who, like most wealthy fathers, preferred that his son become a well-to-do businessman. But when Eliezer was 22 years old, he decided that he would rather become a scholar. And so at a relatively advanced age, he made his way to Yavne and enrolled in the academy of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. His father was furious at him for abandoning the family business and going into something as impractical as Talmudic scholarship. He made up his mind after some time that he would himself, the father that is, travel to Yavne and there publicly disinherit his son. When he came to Yavne, the great teacher Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai noticed him and called out to Eliezer, saying, Amod udrosh, rise up and deliver the lecture. Eliezer was truly frightened, because he regarded himself as only a beginner, disqualified and unprepared for such a task. But the teacher insisted, and Eliezer delivered himself of a brilliant and scintillating Talmudic lecture. So impressive were his words that the audience gasped, and the teacher kissed the student upon the forehead. When Eliezer's father Hyrcanus saw this, he arose and declared that although he had come to disinherit Eliezer, he now wished to announce that he is so overwhelmed that he is going to leave all his money and estate to his son. So here is certainly an example where a person standing for their principles does win the respect and awe of would-be naysayer who was trying to convince them, to follow their path. All through his life, and this is where I think it gets, for me, particularly interesting, what happens if you follow this approach all the way, and where do we land on that? All through his life, Rabbi Eliezer continued to demonstrate this single-minded stubbornness of following what is right, no matter who is in the opposition. At one crucial point of his life, when he was already a world-famous teacher and had distinguished students, counting among them no less a figure than Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer clashed with his colleagues on a point of law. This is what's the famous Tanuro Shalachnai story. They declared a certain oven as tameh, ritually unclean, and he pronounced it tahor, ritually clean. When the matter was taken to a vote and the opposition won, Rabbi Eliezer refused to go along. The matter led to a confrontation. Because it's not relevant to his point, but another sermon, Rabbi Lamb leaves out the whole lo bashamayim, he and God comes in to side with Rabbi Eliezer. That's sort of tangential to this thread of thought, so he leaves it out. But those who know the story or are interested in the story, it's a worthwhile study on its own. We've studied it in various settings in the Bayit over the years. The matter led to a confrontation, and as a result of Rabbi Eliezer's persistence and his refusal to accede to majority rule, he was placed in excommunication and remained in this ban for many years until his death. He was beloved by his colleagues and students, revered universally, and yet in order for the halakha to survive, they felt it necessary to take this extreme action against him. But he refused to be budged. The principle he found in the divine tefillin sheberosh was something he implemented in his own life. I think it's such an interesting story because he's a tragic figure in a certain sense. I don't know that the takeaway is that he should have changed his mind, but if the message, if this is the consequence of taking this to its kind of fullest, it comes to me to a point to become a less compelling argument. I don't want to be excommunicated. Yes, you got to stand your ground and do what you feel is right, come what may. But there is some point at which, when you lose your friends, your own community, your sphere of influence. So I think it's interesting that he really pushes this and chooses the example. It's powerful, and what I love the weaving this thread that this Rabbi Eliezer, who makes this comment in the Talmud, it's not a passing comment by a random individual. This is central to his own worldview and philosophy, and it plays out in his life story, and it's powerful. But the end of the story makes it challenging to think about applying this lesson to our own lives. Now, the shift from individual to national. If this is true for us as individuals, it is certainly true for Israel as a people today. We must be prepared for what is coming upon us. We must recognize that the state of Israel is in for some difficult times in the diplomatic and political world, and possibly even militarily. Israel is more and more facing isolation. It has earned the enmity of the Soviet Union. It is isolated from the Third World, who in their recent assembly repeated the ritualistic condemnation of and hatred for Israel. The UN continues treating Israel like a pariah, and the Civil Airlines Organization, this is today, which always procrastinates and dawdles when hijackings are carried out against Israeli aircraft, springs into a sudden burst of zealous efficiency when Israel takes action and try to prevent hijacking without any loss of life or property. Right? Obviously, the current situation of commercial airlines and Israel is very front of mind. Arab oil is now being used, perhaps for the first time, in a deliberate attempt to isolate Israel diplomatically. The energy crisis in the US is exaggerated in order to fall in line with this pressure. Interesting comment. Russian-American détente promises no great help for Israel. A weakened presidency leaves Israel in a most difficult position. And if we are honest with ourselves, we will admit, coming back to Rabbi Scott's comment, that pleased as we are at having the first Jewish Secretary of State in American history, we are also worried lest he will bend over backwards in an attempt to prove that he is not prejudiced in favor of Israel. All the discussion surrounding Josh Shapiro as vice presidential candidate comes right back to mind. So we must be prepared to remain alone, friendless, isolated. At times of crisis, by the way, I want to say, if I imagine myself giving this drasha, I sort of want to include a statement of, this is not the ideal, right? Our vision is to live in peace and harmony and build strong bridges with it's interesting to me that he mostly sort of leaves that out in order to make his argument that we have, maybe because people are so hesitant and resistant to it, so he has to drive it home all the way. I always like to have in the background, we have to do this thing if called upon, but it's not what we want to be doing. So it's that I'm 50 years, Monday morning quarterbacking here. Yeah.
That he really kept to something like this. There was no, for someone who I think of as like always trying to build with others.
Yes.
Really wasn't there in his drasha.
Yes.
His whole drasha was we stand alone.
Yes.
Gee, I don't know. I have to look. I guess I don't know.
Yes, this was Elisheva's comment that Rav Avi's speech the last Kol Nidre night paralleled this very much and didn't soften with that side, and there are moments when that is perhaps called for. So, just noting the alternative route of what could have been included and wasn't here. I have no doubt it was a thought in Rabbi Lamb's mind, and in some way an intentional decision. At times of crisis, it has been our experience for this past quarter century that Israelis usually rally, right? Quarter century, that's how long the state of Israel was around at that time. It was 25 years old. Whereas diaspora Jews usually cave in. To the dismay of most Israelis, we Jews of the diaspora panic rather quickly. So Israel must certainly continue to seek friends where it can. And we American Jews, yes, there is that line. And we American Jews must use our political influence and clout discreetly and wisely. But we must not panic. We must remember that our normal condition is Am levadad yishkon, quoting Bilam and Parshat Balak, a people that dwells alone. We must draw strength and not weakness from the knowledge that we are chativa chat ba'olam, one unit in the world. And by the way, I think also just when I imagine giving a drasha like this, I would add a dimension about unity, right? That chativa achat, it's not just vis-a-vis externally, we are alone and we are one separate from everyone else. But this only succeeds if we are united and unified and one. I think that's like another dimension of this that I might imagine including. We must draw strength and not weakness from the fact that we are chativa achat ba'olam, often alone and different in the world. It is during these times of loneliness when we are goy echad ba'aretz, again going back to the what's in God's tefillin, one nation upon the earth, as the statement in God's tefillin declares, that we will draw the admiration and respect. Again, that's his argument that we will. I don't know. I think I don't know if it actually happens. It ought to happen, but that we will draw the admiration and respect of others who will appreciate our strength and courage during these periods of solitude, who will recognize that the name of the Lord is called upon you, and then we shall prevail. Again, I think that in my mind, as I read this, it's like that piece, the what others will think of you, is unavoidable because it's in the verse, but I don't think it's the central piece of the argument in the end. I do not mean to say that American Jews must offer blind support for every Israeli policy, whether foreign or certainly internal. This is also, a tension I think rabbis feel today, raising the question of, of where is criticism? Where is the place of criticism? Do we have a voice, in what's going on in Israel? And so it's, I'm struck by the fact that he includes this here, even as he approaches the crescendo. I do not mean to say that American Jews must offer blind support for every Israeli policy, whether foreign or certainly internal. But if the decision of the Israelis should be to go it alone, let us not try to move them on the basis of our own inner panic. At such times, we must give them strength and not infect them with our weakness. It is at times of this sort that we must be aware of the principle enunciated in the divine tefillin. We have been, we are, and we will probably always remain goy echad ba'aretz. By the way, a rhetorical flourish that Rav Avi uses that I have not read enough of Rabbi Lamb's sermons to know if he does it, but I could picture Rav Avi doing here, and I have tried to adopt in some places, is to repeat a key line, right? To say again, we have been, we are, and we will probably always remain goy echad ba'aretz. This is our burden and glory, as the name of the Lord is called upon us. We shall remain one nation, all alone under God. We've got 5 minutes for questions or comments. Happy to hear anyone on Zoom who wants to share a thought or a reaction. Please feel free. Estelle?
Unfortunately, Jews never are united, no matter what or when or and in any generation. I wish we could be united, but I think it's in our makeup always to disagree. And unfortunately, it's not only in America, it's in Israel too. Yet united is the word it should be, because otherwise the rest of the world would respect us more if we did. But no matter what we do, it always seems to be wrong by the rest of the world. It's a very difficult situation, really.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely appreciate that. I want to say one thing before hearing if others want to offer any other comments. I picked this sermon not because I picked the sermon because it spoke to me, maybe because it's a slightly different angle than the one I would normally take. I don't know that it's exactly a sermon I would deliver, but maybe in a sense, it's a sermon I feel I need to hear sometimes. Not because I feel myself at risk of assimilation, but because, I think I lean much more towards bridge building and see, going it alone as a last resort. And again, he might not disagree with that. He would just say, I think he comes to sort of just both describe it as an unavoidable reality at the end of the day on many occasions, and also to lift it up with this theme of God's tefillin. I think if I were going to give this sermon, I might equally talk, again, coming back to the unity, we're not alone because we have each other. I think in a certain way, he's sort of saying we're not alone because we are in God's tefillin. And I think those are also kind of what brings people strength or solace in the recognition of our sometimes necessary isolation. Is it sort of the sense that, but we are God's people, or is it sort of the sense that we're going it alone, but we have each other? So I just, when I read it, it really spoke to me. I thought, again, as a model of a sermon, it's weaves the parsha, a rabbinic teaching, then builds out the biography of the speaker in a way that's sort of unexpected and beautiful, and I think has a complex ending. Touches on the personal and the national. So I think, it's a model sermon in my mind in terms of covering so many bases while remaining kind of tight and coherent in a beautiful way. Other thoughts or reactions?
Oh,
And then we'll come. Okay, yeah. Who was that? Was that Debbie? Go ahead.
yeah. I had the chus of hearing him in person. He was a powerful, majestic speaker. So I think the words also were imbued with a real power when he spoke. His delivery was also awesome, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
So that each word was imbued with real power and force when he spoke. So, reading it strips it of some of its meaning, and the way he delivered it, and he modulated his voice also. So it loses it when it's just on paper.
Yeah, I absolutely appreciate that. Some sermons read and you can kind of feel their power straight away, and others, I think, really depend on being in the room and experiencing it. So I really appreciate that. And I haven't yet chosen the Rabbi Sharon Brous sermon, but if it turns out to be one which has, a video recording, maybe we'll watch an excerpt of it just to get the feel of experiencing it as a delivered sermon, which is obviously central to the experience. Elisheva?
I was just thinking about kind of the time and moment when sermons are delivered. Which, like, you talk about kind of the kind of sermons of now, but also, like, I keep thinking that, like, this year, it seems to me that the Shabbat Shuva Drasha isn't going to be the hardest one. That actually, like, there might be words for that, but when you get to Yisker on Shmini Atzeret, what could you possibly say in a drasha that?
Right.
And this, I don't know, I'm just thinking, like, that when there are words and when there aren't.
Yeah.
And when there's space for a message of hope and solidarity, and when there's just this importance between one and just being because there are no words.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. It's I think it's a really important reflection, something I certainly think about. And I will also say, this is a terrible analogy, but what it did make me think of is there's sportscasters in significant moments when you hear different calls of the same, Hank Aaron's whatever it was, 715th home run. Some of them will try to describe what's happening in the moment, and some of them will go silent for 20 seconds and just allow you to listen and kind of feel whatever is happening. It's not an exact analogy, but I think that when do words attempt to create something? When do words just try to help frame, enabling us to experience what is happening for us? I think is a really, and when our words inevitably just get in the way of whatever it is we need to be doing. Yes, I don't. Not correct.
Yeah, how can you possibly give that?
Yeah.
Why
Mhm.
not spoil the moment, but kind of what it's completely impossible, and it's trying to bring up emotion or thoughts that not everyone will share, though everyone will share grief.
Yes.
And so why again, this idea of keeping the oneness, so just keep the grief.
Yeah.
Just let everyone be together in that one thing we can all feel, instead of trying to put words that will resonate with some and not resonate with others.
Yeah.
Like, why in this moment don't use words, because they will inevitably divide.
Yeah, interesting. I'll take that very much to heart as I think ahead. Rabbi Scott, and then Gary and Judy. Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think he would not have been true to himself if he didn't give the rest of Rabbi Eliezer's story.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was necessary for him to do that. And I do believe, as he wrote here, that people do respect you if you stand up for what you believe.
Yeah.
And sometimes in a setting like where we live, it's very different than a setting in a small town where you have to fight for everything,
Yeah.
whether it's a day off from school or
Mm-hmm.
making allowances for kids to do their assignments or whatever
Yes.
it is. And if you just go along to get along, then people don't respect you.
Yeah.
Because they see that you don't respect
Mm-hmm.
what you should be respecting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Beautiful. Spoken sounds like from lived experience, no doubt. Okay, Gary and Judy, and then I think I saw Rona's hand, and then we're going to wrap up. Unfortunately, I have to run. Gary and Judy, go ahead.
Just a quick feeling of the power of this unbelievable drasha, and the feelings that we had in 1973 of terror and fear and davening together and unity, and how we feel now, and how it feels incredibly word for word so much the same. But the difference in these 50 years and what's going on right now, and for many of us who've been in Israel this year and witnessed the strength and the power of the people, of just uniting and working together, volunteering, picking oranges, davening, activity, activism, all of us in the Bayit who are involved in the WhatsApp groups of activism. There's just so much chizuk, I guess. I mean, the same fear and terror, truthfully, but the strength that we have gained over these 50 years as a people, it just kind of hits me that we were scared and davening, but we were not able to do as a Jewish community what we're doing right now, and feeling the strength of our peers in Israel, and gaining strength from them, truthfully. So that just is coming.
Action. Thank you. Rona, did you want to comment as well? You're muted, so go ahead and unmute yourself. We don't hear you yet. Okay, we good. We hear you. Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm very confused about the Rabbi Eliezer story. One, it really disturbs me because the Midrash is all about rabbis having different opinions. So the fact that they excommunicate him when he's such a brilliant rabbi really disturbs me.
Yeah.
And it seems to contradict everything he's saying about we should be unified. So why is it in there? Or
That's a fascinating question. You know, the dynamics there actually have to do with majority rule and the idea that in rabbinic decision making, ultimately, once the majority has ruled, you have to follow the majority, and everyone, even the dissenters, have to practically follow the majority, but you can still stand your ground about your opinion. It just seems like Rabbi Eliezer was, you know, unwilling to follow the ruling. He would, in other words, it would be one thing to say, I still think you're wrong, but I go along, you know, because I belong in community. And, you know, there is, I agree with you. There is that sort of tension between, you know, standing your ground and staying united with community. It's there. It doesn't feel totally resolved in the drasha. So I appreciate that comment as well. All right, we're going to pause here. Wonderful to be together and learn with everyone. We have 3 more sermon figures to learn from: Rabbi Yehuda Amital, Rav Moshe Amiel, and Rabbi Sharon Brous. So looking forward to doing those over the coming weeks. And as much as I can, I'll try to send them in advance for those who want to look in advance. And again, if you Google LAM, L-A-M-M, archives, you can find beautifully organized lots of Rabbi Lam sermons for your consideration. So thanks to all.
Thank you so much.
Mom and Dad,
Thank you.
good day to everybody.